Today I'm speaking with award-winning investigative journalist Russ Baker. He is the author of Family of Secrets, The Bush Dynasty, The Powerful Forces That Put It in the White House, and What Their Influence Means for America. Russ is the editor of news site WhoWhatWhy.org, and he is here today to discuss some of the topics his team of reporters are investigating, including the impending war with Syria, inconsistencies with the Boston Marathon bombing, and this whole NSA spying debacle, and why Obama can't undo the surveillance society even if he wanted to. Okay, Russ, so thank you so much for joining us on the Infowars Nightly News. We're happy to have you.
My pleasure.
So now we'll start with the Obama administration and the NSA Spy Scandal. Now, we've heard Obama say that he's going to get to the bottom of, some of the other scandals going on with the AP wiretapping, the IRS, Benghazi. Now he's saying that he's welcoming a debate into this new affront on the American people. Rand Paul says Obama is drunk on power. You say he is essentially helpless. Do you really think that Obama wants to stop the surveillance society that we have, if he could?
I can't read his mind. I don't have any real sense of what type of person he is after all of these years. And I think we're always sort of dependent on perceptions that are crafted by the electronic media. But my sense is that even if he wants to do something, and I'll give him the benefit of the doubt on some of the promises that he made when he was running for office, and in fact his criticism of George W. Bush on very similar surveillance policies, I think realistically he just can't do anything about it. In fact, that has been a theme in my work and in our work on WhoWhatWhy.com. That if you look back historically, you'll see all the way back to Franklin Roosevelt, he was basically warning that his hands were somewhat tied by people in the financial centers. He wrote a letter to Colonel House, the former chief aide to Woodrow Wilson. He said, "You and I both know that the real power in this country resides not in Washington, but in the great financial centers." Dwight Eisenhower, I think, was very much under the thumb of these same interests, and took a very bold move as he was leaving office with his famous military-industrial complex speech. So I think that all of these presidents essentially are very limited in what they can do. To some extent, they're actors chosen for their ability to perform publicly, and I think that whenever, on the rare occasion, we've had someone like a Roosevelt or particularly a John F. Kennedy who challenged these power centers, they quickly were put in their place, sometimes violently. I think that to some extent the range of the permissible is such that the people from both parties are essentially wings of the same party, and that they understand that that really all they can do is wiggle a little bit, and that's why you don't see huge differences in the kinds of policies, by and large, being proposed by cabinet secretaries and top advisors. I think that's just a reality, and so we certainly see that in carryovers. Even John F. Kennedy, many of the people in his cabinet were Republicans or were carryovers from the Eisenhower administration. It was just a shuffling, really.
Right. So I guess if Obama is blocked, then that means democracy itself is blocked. I mean, doesn't that signal sort of a problem?
I think so. In my book, Family of Secrets, I look at the rise of the Bush dynasty, and I connect it to all kinds of traumatic events in this country, including the assassination of John F. Kennedy. The issue is that we don't really understand these big events. We don't understand what is going on, and we don't really recognize domestic coups when they occur. This sort of thing causes dissonance with a lot of people who like to believe that this country is so much better than other countries, that those sorts of things don't go on. But in fact, it's reasonable to assume that the very same people in this country who think it's perfectly okay to go into other countries and mess about with their democracies and overthrow their leaders would not hesitate to do the same thing in this country. I think because the stakes are so much higher and it's so much riskier, that those kinds of things are much more carefully planned and carried out. But I think that any person who becomes president would have to be a complete idiot not to realize that they are expected to do certain things.
Now, I know that WhoWhatWhy has been reporting for about 2 years, saying that the Obama administration was not to be trusted in giving the whole official narrative of why they want to oust Assad for humanitarian reasons. And so what do you think about the New York Times basically reporting that Obama finally had to succumb to tremendous pressure to get involved in Syria?
Right. Almost everything you read in the mainstream media are calculated leaks. So they start by leaking things that indicating that they're going to be moving forward with military aggression against the Assad regime, and then they leak that Obama didn't really want to do it. These are all calculated. So, for example, whether or not Obama wanted to do it, that leak, that last leak you referred to, is designed to mollify his base, those who still believe that he's basically a decent guy and that he still has some kind of power. And so it's very important for them to and so instead of him saying, I had to do it because the generals forced me or Wall Street forced me or what have you, he says, I had to do it because Bill Clinton pressured me, which is quite funny. And of course, that's setting up Hillary Clinton to run for president herself. But what really is going on is that none of those wars are about humanitarian things at all. They never have been. They never will be. Frankly, nor should they be. If you or I were sitting in the Pentagon or in the National Security Council, we were discussing what to do in other countries, we wouldn't be discussing human rights and how to make people in Pakistan happier and so on. We'd be talking about so-called national security, which broadly defined is what benefits the United States, which more narrowly defined means what benefits those who have the most power in this country. And that really comes down to a continued policy of a kind of an imperial approach. And the United States isn't alone on that. I think China and Russia and so forth, we're all battling for markets and resources. It's been that way since time immemorial.
Exactly. And so what do you think about the ties between the mainstream media and the Obama administration? The president of CBS News is related to his aspiring novelist turned deputy national security advisor, Benjamin Rhodes. So it seems like the mainstream media is sort of getting us warmed up to go to war with Syria, or initially it was Libya. And what do you think about that?
Well, that's quite right. In fact, I think we can see that the mainstream media has learned nothing from its errors and then subsequent mea culpas over Iraq and all the other things that they got wrong and how they were tricked, perfectly happy to continue along that path. And we see that with Libya on WhoWhatWhy. We've been I think we were quite early to that story and still are virtually alone in reporting that that was never about the Gaddafi policies towards his own people. It was always about other geopolitical and strategic considerations. We detail that quite heavily in an article you can find on the right-hand side of our site, WhoWhatWhy. Also, Syria, other issues in play, but again, strategic calculations. And the media, for some reason, I'd like to say it's inexplicable to me, but I think it's perfectly explicable. The way our media is structured, it's dependent primarily on funding from wealthy interests, from the patronage of wealthy consumers and so forth, and that really is where their bread is buttered. And so they're going to do some good reporting. There's no question. I mean, I've worked in the mainstream media. I have plenty of friends in it. I made a decision to leave it and to start WhoWhatWhy because I felt that we were constrained. We weren't able to tell the whole story. So you'll see bits of the story there, but you've got to really kind of step back and take your own reading to figure out what really is going on.
Right, and so you guys are doing a lot of investigative journalism and uncovering the news, basically the things that the news fails to report on or just kind of covers. For instance, you all are digging a little deeper into some of the inconsistencies with the Boston Marathon bombings. We've covered that here at Infowars as well, so what else can you tell me?
Well, sure. I mean, so we're sort of old-fashioned journalists. There are many outlets, of course, that comment on the news and express their opinions and speculate. We do real old-fashioned reporting, and so I spent weeks myself in Boston on the ground, going and talking to people. We have other people. We've built a team, other people working on the story, doing analysis, doing all kinds of things. And very importantly is that we go into these stories without an agenda. And now some people would say, yeah, sure, nobody goes in without an agenda. But to be a good journalist, you really have to do that. You have to say, I would want to know what happened there. I want to know if these two guys did it. I want to know if there were other people helping them. I want to know everything. I want to know about all these anomalies. I want to know why the younger brother, why they shot him so many times in that boat when, in fact, he had no weapon. I want to know whether he really scrawled a confession on the wall. Why? How somebody who was so gravely wounded could have or would have been inclined to prop himself up and scrawl a confession. It makes you think that somebody thought that he was going to die. So, I mean, these are all very, very strange things, and somebody has to look into them. So our attitude is we're agnostic until we do our research.
So what are some of the other stories that you would really, if Obama could save himself and kind of gain a little trust with the public again, what are some of the stories you'd like for him to unclassify?
Well, I mean, as you probably know from WhoWhatWhy, we've been talking a lot about the remaining classified records of the John F. Kennedy assassination. Very troubling that there are still an estimated 50,000 documents with references or information that appears to be related to the Kennedy assassination that the government has held back. Here we are on the 50th anniversary of what the government has told us was simply a lone eccentric or perhaps nutty figure shooting Kennedy, that there was nothing more to that. If that's true, then it's hard to understand what could possibly need to remain secret 50 years later. And so we see with Obama him sort of continuing again, like Bush and like other presidents, in cooperating with this what I guess you would say is a policy of assuring us that it's better that we don't know, that for democracy to work well, we need to be protected from ourselves. We don't have good judgment as to what it is that we can know. And of course, they're always referring to America's enemies, but I'd love for them to articulate who are America's enemies who would gain if they released all the records on the John F. Kennedy assassination.
So what do you think we would actually find if those documents were released?
Well, I was, again, agnostic on the Kennedy assassination, as I am on most topics, until I happened upon it in a sort of bizarre way while researching the Bush family and discovered that George H.W. Bush couldn't remember where he was on November 22, 1963. I decided to just figure out where he was, because I know that everybody over the age of 5 remembers where they were when they heard about the shooting of Kennedy. And so that took me down this kind of rabbit's hole, and I became fascinated with the Kennedy assassination. I spent some years on it and have actually about 5 chapters in Family of Secrets on the Kennedy assassination. I have become convinced that, in fact, that was essentially a coup d'etat, that, in fact, elements of military intelligence and of other spy agencies, the CIA and the FBI, at least were involved in covering it up, also involved with the autopsy in order to hide the fact that there were multiple bullets hit Kennedy from more than one direction, all of which points to the fact that it was an organized hit. And so I think that that is even shown from some of the documents that have already been released by the diligent efforts of amateur researchers sort of connecting the dots. And I think that whatever those remaining 50,000 are, they must be pretty explosive. I'd certainly like to take a look at them.
Well, I know we would all definitely love to get to the bottom of that story as well 50 years later. But now the New York Times has sort of said people who question the official story are just conspiracy theorists. So how do you reconcile that, being an award-winning investigative journalist? Now they're calling you conspiracy theorist.
Well, I don't know if they're specifically calling me that, but the general message has been put out consistently over the years, and they've stepped up the effort this year to sort of remind people that asking questions and not trusting the official story is dangerous. And so this term conspiracy theory is one that I personally abhor, because it's actually too useful words. Conspiracy meaning 2 or more people getting together to commit a crime, which is not a fantasy, it's a reality, and it's prosecuted in courthouses throughout the country on a daily basis. And theory, which is how we learn and how we come to understand things. So conspiracy theory really ought to be a neutral term, referencing attempts to understand how crimes are committed. And it's sort of tragic that that term has been taken over. It's now what you might call a dysphemism instead of a euphemism. It's a word or a phrase that automatically sort of taints whoever you apply it to, and it just shuts the discussion down. Now, I'll be the first to say that I am not a fan of those who believe that there is something sinister going on with everything that that person themselves is not involved with. I don't think that's healthy, and I think there's been too much of a growth industry in that in this country. But I do think that we have to go in with an open mind and accept that sometimes people in the government are doing good work, and exactly what they tell us is the truth. I think it's very, very important to appreciate that the government is full of millions of people just like ourselves. But at the same time, be open to the idea that there are individuals, whether it's in the civilian parts of the government or the military or the CIA or in private industry or in nonprofits or anywhere else, who have untoward agendas. And I think that that's the important thing. And I think that places like the New York Times, which sort of disparage people who want to know, could all of these shootings throughout America's history, could they all have been lone kooks? When we look at other countries, we see that most of them eventually are settled as having been hits by powerful interests to remove people. And the idea that none of these people, whether it was Martin Luther King or Robert Kennedy or John F. Kennedy, or even statistically, if you look at small plane crashes, statistically, a disproportionate share of those are labor leaders and sort of liberal politicians. That's actually a fact. Or they're conservative politicians who fell afoul of their buddies, people who were on the Warren Commission, people like John Tower. It's a fascinating subject, and to think that nobody would ever be requested or inclined to go and take a screwdriver and loosen a bolt in an engine or something. I mean, that's preposterous. And what kind of journalists just dismiss any consideration of these scenarios? I would say that they are the ones that are irresponsible.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of that irresponsibility in journalism.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Journalism is like anything else. It's funded largely by wealthy interests and by the capitalist system, and that means that there are going to be limitations on what people can report. Those of us who've worked in the mainstream media know that we try to do the best job we can, but we understand there are limitations, and we self-censor, or our editors, in usually only slightly subtle terms, inform us of when we've gone too far. I remember one story, an editor said to me, go out and bring me a big story. I brought him something which I thought was very big. He looked at it and he said, that's too big.
So, Russ, you covered the fall of communism in East Germany, and you likened the fall of that surveillance society to something that we could achieve here in the U.S. How so, and do we stand a chance?
I think my point is that I and many other people have grown increasingly nervous as we see our so-called enemies having become freer and freer, and us become less and less free. There's a certain kind of an irony and a paradox in that, of course, and some poetry as well. But I think that these measures that are being taken increasingly to supposedly protect us do not protect us. They essentially enslave us. I think they have a very hard time showing us that we are safer, showing that even if we are safer, that these kinds of measures and this kind of total surveillance of all of society to catch a few people is actually worth it in the long run. If you ask people, would you give up your freedom to ensure a slightly lower risk that you will be blown up? I don't think people would. And I think we need to have a vigorous discussion about that. I also think that we need to acknowledge that there are people in this country in positions of power, of great wealth and so on, who are less excited about democracy than they say they are. That they were supporters of fascists and others, perfectly happy with a Pinochet or a Franco, and so their commitment to democracy is something that I would question. And I think that when they're pushing for knowing more and more about us, and at the same time, paradoxically, telling us less and less about our own government, we have reason to be deeply, deeply alarmed. And I mean, I do support having security measures that are necessary, but I think we need to have much more accountability. And I think that one of the things I saw when I was in East Germany, I referenced this briefly in a recent article on WhoWhatWhy, is that I was there literally before the wall came down, and I saw when there was a break and there was a sense that they could be free, that individuals began stirring and they began taking action. And I saw young people who would put on ski masks and then get on buses and hand out leaflets. And I attended a meeting with a Christian church leader there and his congregation, where sort of a covert meeting where they began discussing what they might be able to do and so forth. And it was very exciting to see. And I think it's sad that in this country, more people don't step up and do something. And it's really not enough to just sort of complain. You have to get involved. And the reality is, if enough people made their voices heard, went out in the streets, were more active on the internet in terms of sharing important articles with other people, I think at some point the elected representatives would have to respond to that, would have to listen, and we might have a real fighting chance to preserve democracy before it's too late.
Well, I agree, but I wonder, do you think that we're a little sort of trapped because everything is so electronically, connected now, and that's sort of being spied on, and with, Google algorithms and things like that can sort of steer which way things get shared? Do we need to unplug and just get back to the word of mouth and handing out leaflets?
Well, I mean, I think we do need to try to appreciate the joys of life, which include actually being with people in the flesh, saying hello to neighbors on the street, that it's not the same thing as bragging about how great your vacation was on Facebook. I think that we need to unplug a bit, as you point out. I think we need people, unfortunately, who can have the same electronic skills that the others have to maybe help us find ways to protect our own privacy. And I think that, very importantly, we need to be more suspicious of all of this technology as just being something good. I particularly am struck by the younger generation and its enthusiasm for everything. I think these things like Google Glass are real violations of our privacy. And I think that the fact that we don't hear more young people saying these are bad developments, I want to stop it. I mean, there could be boycotts of Google and Apple and all of these things if people cared enough. And I think those companies would respond, because after all, they're for-profit enterprises.
Well, that sounds like some really good material for a new book or a whole nother new book. So what are you working on now?
Well, I don't formally announce books until I get at publication or close to publication, but I could just say that some of the topics that we discussed here today are definitely things that I'm looking at. I feel like I've got a whole bunch of books in me, and the real problem is just time constraints. Exactly.
Well, Russ, thank you so much for continuing to investigate and uncover the news. I know there's obviously, as we have proven here today, there is so much more news that remains to be answered. So thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much.
All right, well, if you'd like to continue supporting alternative news, please consider signing up for a PrisonPlanet.tv account. You can share your username and password with up to 10 other people, which means 11 people can sign on simultaneously. Now join us here at the Infowars Nightly News 5 nights a week at 7 p.m. Central. I'm Leanne McAdoo signing off for the Infowars Nightly News. Now you can watch The Alex Jones Show live as it happens at Infowars.com/show.
You'll find links to all of our content there and a free 15-day trial for Prison Planet TV.
More than 60 movies and documentaries all in one place at Infowars.com/show.